I've been going chapter by chapter, but perhaps on a single reading I may do two chapters. That is why each of these clips will be titled as readings and not as chapters. The minds will keep turning out their mutations, will they not? That had been Bruzellam's assessment. Gamut Triskelion was far from sure that was the case. But then Bozellum wasn't really interested in the organic processes and misfires that led to mutation. It was imperfect. If a part was imperfect, then cut it from the whole. That was his creed. A library of moldering texts, liturgies of the human body, its uses and functionality, all wasted on the fabricator general. Year on year, Triskelion had scraped and scavenged for resources. For the handful of genitor priests still clinging on in Brazilium's administration, seeking to test old knowledge and even, horror of horrors, perhaps add to it in some small way, rediscover, as it would only have ever been known. He had read over some small fragments of a text once about the creation of the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's represented champions. His only conclusion had been if we had been blind as this back then, as we are now, what stunted, miserable things would we ever created? They had understood the organic sciences back then. What was done by rote now had been discovered by inquiring minds in the mists of time. All those enhanced organs and faculties. Every space marine was a miracle of biological engineering. And yet, Brazellum dismissed as unconsciously radical. Triskelian's every plea to study how the parts of the human body might be improved rather than simply replaced. And he had taken samples from the three-armed assassin, cut from her rough flesh as she snarled and snapped at him. He had interrogated his scrapings with the wheezing deduction engines that subjected them to questioning the Inquisition that with the wheezing deduction engines that subjected them to a questioning the Inquisition would approve of. Mr. Chikanovsky, Chikiovsky, this guy. Sometimes I don't exactly meet his pace in writing, but while when I read this, it kind of annoyed me just the way he writes. But I can tell you by the end of the novel, it grew on me. By the beginning of this novel, because there is another. I mean, the thing about Gin Stealer cults is they're all the same. It's all the same thing. There's no. I mean, the distinction may vary in terms of like, which fleet they represent, and then like how long the infestation's been there, and then like if they're on like a cemetery world, they're gonna have like cemetery themed cultists, and if they're in a lava world, they're gonna have lava themed cult. Like that's the variation there, but it's the same thing, right? If you took like if you somehow had two parallel universes, right, and you took two different cults and you put them on the same lava world, you'd have the same lava cult. They would just be calling in a different direction. That's the difference. It's all, but so what I'm saying is once you've read one Jenna Steeler book, you've read them all. It's so hard to do any sort of variation. This book, it may it's of course it sets itself up for a sequel, very 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 cheekily, I might add, but and it's plausible. But the reason why none of this is an issue is because the Genus Stealer cult is so fun. It's such a fun faction, and it's a new it's I can't say it's a new faction because they've been around for a while, but they and the Adeptus Astartes really got fleshed out once they got armies. And so like in terms of relatively new contributions of like lore behind, armies, that it's all really solid stuff. In fact, I just realized that this book, it's basically just an advertisement for both of those new factions. I'm fairly certain every unit in this book you can purchase. I'm fairly there's not even one thing out of place here. I mean, it's tech priests. You could choose any number of guys from that book, from that codex. To represent a tech priest. And he had taken samples from the three-armed assassin, cut from her rough flesh as she snarled and snapped at him. He had interrogated his scrapings with the wheezing deduction engines that subjected them to a questioning the Inquisition would approve of. Poisons, radiation, physical trauma, pushing their resilience past breaking point, because the only way you could know how tough a thing was to break it. And he found he knew the pattern. He'd observed it before, though not in such concentrations. Those times he'd been able to scrounge live subjects for testing, there have been strains of the Morad populace who had displayed resiliences and immunities that had piqued his interest. And then, like Berzelum, he thought mutation, but unlike his superior, Triskelion dared to consider how that mutation might be put to use. By that time, obviously, he had run out of subjects. As noted, the only way you could know how tough a thing was to break it. He was left only with his records, great long scrolls of calculations through which a disquieting thread ran. There was something different about certain Morad bloodlines. That was different. Different to the regular run of mankind, yet consistent within itself. A most durable and persistent mutation. And certain texts prescribed and fenced about with the inquisitorial seals, there were complex tests one could administer to the mutant and the deformed. There was a litany of signs and omens, responses to certain diagnostic compounds, a secret language written in the shape of the eye, the number of the teeth, the fine structure of the skin and joints. And these signs pointed not to mere human deviance, but something darker. Okay, good. Yet the texts Triskelion had access to, or maddeningly incomplete, and Berzelum had no interest in expanding that section of the Platinum Library. Insalubris, he had said dismissively. If your hand offends you, Viserial, just cut it. Cut it off and fix up a new one. Don't dabble your other fingers in the pus of the wound. And of course, that was a sore point now. His new arm was slow in taking. Triskelion had enough self-knowledge to suspect his own attitude was interfering with his control of it. The mechanical limb was a heartbeat slow in response. Three-fingered hand fumbling, now feeble, now destructively strong. His mechanical eyes had been easier to come to terms with. But then he'd endured the surgery and the discomfort stoically, desperate to return to the lab. And even while he was trying to come to his terms with the artificial limb, this nonsense, Ascension Day. Being placed in charge of the authorities' conscription pool was an honor on paper, a tedious chore in reality. It took Triskelion from his worship, that study of the sciences, whereby a priest might come to truly know the will of the Messiah. To spend days grinding to the worst streets of the city with the cage wagons, census in hand, and beating at every door, left him feeling wasted. And as he got further from the Palladium into the poorer districts, the census became worthless, and it was a matter of just going street by street, rounding every corner and every likely subject. Every half hour, the burning red pain in his mangled shoulder would rise up inside him, and he would have to adjust the flow of numbing compounds feeding into his abused flesh. Ascension Day, the high point of the Murad calendar, if you were a compliant member of the priesthood. There were ships in orbit, ready to take the planet's tide of flesh and blood, kith and kin. The practice had become an excuse to celebrate under Bozellum. There would be fasting, and the mortification of the flesh, and the scouring of the machine. There would be a feast, and the priesthood would offer up in flames those defective things it wished to purge itself from, like people. The assassin's execution would be only the centerpiece of a greater cleansing. Through such fires are we tempered, Brazilian would proclaim, as always. So our impurities are burned away. Triskelion hated it. The only true worship was in knowledge. That was his creed. Casting these wretches into the fire was a waste of material that could go towards his own experiments into measuring the toughness of the flesh. Every moment he was out here in the streets. And this was a moment of true reflection and worship denied to him. In his ear, another augmatic replacement, he heard the voices of his Skitarii officers. They had run into resistance in the next clave. The locals had barricaded the streets and now thronged 8 stories of windows and walls, shouting, waving banners, throwing stones, and shooting simple guns. They were one of the mine workers' collectives that had suffered recently from the failed air pumps and inadequate safety protocols. Now, they were to lose the youngest and strongest of their offspring to the conscription, and the weakest to the offering, and they weren't having it. Triskelion sighed. The world seemed determined to complicate his life, when all he wanted to do was to return to the laboratory. He ran through the passages of the prescribed canticle against civic disobedience, constructing an appropriate protocol to inload to the Skitarii. The squad alphas replied one by one with the correct response. His words would reconfigure their very minds, making them fit for urban warfare, making them not care that the people he was setting them on might have been their own families once. They would clear the street without mercy, set an example that would have the clave falling over itself to offer up its finest for the pool. He had never considered himself a battlefield commander, but Brazilian would excoriate him over any waste, and so he sent a couple of servo skulls to hover over the fracas so that he could adjust the Skitarii's priorities. The locals had nothing going for them but construction tools and brute animal aggression, but the close confines meant they had been able to close with the Skitarii, pitting themselves against the cybernetic strength of the Adeptus Mechanicus soldiers. The line of steel and red cloth held, gun butts bludgeoning away with mechanical rhythm. 1 or 2 fell, though, and there were enough of the rioters that sheer mass was forced in line back. Triskelion hissed through his teeth at the indignity of it, and took quick stock of what resources were close by. At his signal, a pair of dragoons stalked in. He'd hoped their tall shapes would break the spirit of the crowd, but apparently things had advanced too far for that. It was time to exhaust some labor resources in order to teach a salutary lesson to the rest. He ordered the dragoons forward, watching their long legs carry them at a charge down the street. Shoulder to shoulder, lances leveled. Behind them, a third tall shape moved in the sight. One of the iron-strired ballistari, armed with a pair of autocannon. Quite literally overkill. Briefly, he considered ordering the gun platform to hold off, in case the Sidonians' charge carried the day, but he was keenly aware of wasting time. There would always be more workers, but time was a resource both precious and irreplaceable. Fire, he signaled, and the operator loosed over the heads of the Scutari a barrage of munitions, thundering into the crowd, tearing apart their close-packed ranks. For a moment, there was enough loose biology misting the air to send Brazilium into fits, and after the spirit of the rioters was satisfactorily broken, as was the tenement building that they had been pressed up against. In fact, the wall sloughing into the road and exposing a maze of little cells and rooms that had each been a family's home. Plenty of the non-combatant denizens were under the rubble, but that still left plenty of them penned by the Scutari, awaiting disposal. He unloaded a replacement catechism for the lead alpha, allowing the cyborg to better assess each candidate. The infants and the strong for one wagon, the badly injured, sickly, or maimed for another. Trimming away the scrap from the true, Brazil would say, and those in between would have the privilege of going back to work at the mines and manufactura for the greater industry of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The fighting at the far end of the street was almost done. Just a few pockets of resistance as the workers were brutally disabused of their notions. Triskelion looked over the mass of penned humanity thoughtfully, then unloaded a slight variant to the regular catechisms, waiting to see if the Alpha would protest or return any errors. The officer went on sorting, though, with a third category. There were only a handful with that particular deviation that he was interested in. If I cannot be in my laboratory, Triskelion decided, I will bring my research with me. He tested each curiously, finding most to be no more than victims of bad air and toxic metals, twisted at birth, or during some course of their rough lives. But there was one. He had devised his own diagnostic tool for work on the assassin. It reacted to the presence of certain curious properties, not usually found in human blood. It was an innovation, and he knew it was less than reliable. But where better to test it than in the field? One particular subject, she had been badly injured by the collapse, but she'd still been strangely formed already. There was a cancerous-looking swelling about one armpit that might have been the stump of a vestigial limb. Her skull was long. She was clutching a string of beads in her hands, whimpering over a prayer. Emperor, preserve me. Emperor, catch me with your many hands. The rosary coiled around her fingers like a segmented worm. Where is this woman from? Is she assigned for residency in this habclave? He demanded of one of the prisoners. He didn't think so. He felt he was on the trail of a bloodline, not just some random mutation. Where are all her relatives? Someone came forward, perhaps hoping to earn better treatment, or resenting the woman's whining, or the way she looked. Someone gave him a clave where they could be found. There was a precisely worked out itinerary for all those conscription pool squads, a series of exacting instructions on numbering lines, like a program for the Scutari. He couldn't just make on-the-fly decisions to divert the heart of his force for his own base curiosity. Or rather, the word was, he shouldn't. The biopsy material abstracted from the assassin had shown some very promising results when subjected to all manner of stressors. Suspiciously promising, he had to admit, reacting to things that would kill a human, almost as if the tissue welcomed the challenge. And he should, recoil from the differences that placed the results outside the safe corridor of human variance. Save, he saw a toolkit here for strength and endurance. Such possibilities. It is necessary that I investigate. I am only exercising the mind of the Omnissiah blessed me with. I am only exercising the mind the Omnissiah blessed me with, and he was filing the changes, amending the program so that this squad slowed its advance. That squad deviated to cover the clave Triskelion had been about to advance to, while he unloaded data across the South Chasms district, imagining the whole Skitarii force faltering in lockstep as his priority list was rearranged. Obey me. And he was good at managing the troops. He knew Brazilum and his favorites so seldom had to get their hands dirty with that sort of field logistics. And it wasn't the first time they devolved menial duties onto Visceral Triskelion. It meant that, come to the crunch, he was better at coding instructions for the Skitarii than they were. Adept? The closest Alpha was staring at him, or at least the cluster of lenses and hoses that was the man's face, turned his way. Behind it, the surviving portions of his human mind would be wrestling with the new instructions, trying to fit them in with the existing plan. But it wasn't for the Skitarii to question their masters. He had just sent reinforcement of his order, and the Alpha scurrying to obey. As simple as that, it was done. Triskelion would turn his circus into an opportunity for science. He had expanded the conscription pool protocols to create a third category of prisoners, research subjects. And if his conscience pricked him about going beyond the boundaries of his task, there was a decade of resentment built up on Gamma Triskelion to shout it down. Before he was at the very scalpel's cutting edge of the Genitor Order, tech priests, whose field of study was the human body and how it might be maintained, preserved, and improved. And yet, Brazilum and his clique cared nothing for it. Triskelion had presided over the autopsies of a score of Skitarii who had collapsed when their living cores had been unable to sustain the piston fury of their prosthetics. He knew that the secret was not just to cut further. If the flesh could be strengthened, there would be no limit to the artificial extensions that might be made to the human body. But time and time again, he was denied. The soft sciences, Brazilum would mouth, getting your hands dirty. And Aloysia would echo, unsanitary. If only it had not been him, Triskelion remembered. All those years ago, waiting to hear who would be appointed Fabricator General when the previous incumbent systems finally failed. There had been complex elections and negotiations, and the calculating engines had gorged on data from across the planet. He, Gamut, Triskelion, had been a frontrunner. He had been poised to lead their world into a future of rediscovery and faith through experiment. Life had seemed so full of promise. But Brazilum had beaten him to the post, preferred by their peers and favored by the calculations of the engines. And in the many years since, Triskelion and his fellows had diminished, been overlooked, derided, consigned the degrading of the menial, wasted. In that angry frame of mind, Triskelion and his troops marched into the clave that had supposedly produced the deviant. The full cage wagons had been sent back to the Palladium, and fresh empties had arrived. He was ready to reap whatever harvest this district would yield for him. At first sight, there was little difference here to the tenements he had already moved through, save the walls were still intact and the streets were clear. Nobody had tried to throw up barricades or organize a futile resistance. The Skitarii were already pounding on doors, and it seemed like he had been lied to, that he had sinned by deviating from the prescribed plan and gained himself nothing. The census was checked line by line. A quota of the children was offered up, meager but within tolerance. There were a precious few sick or feeble who could have been taken as offerings, suspiciously few, he might add. There are entreaties in the district records. These poor claves had suffered savagely in past generations. Earlier conscription pool visits had hauled them out, and there had been mine accidents, vitriol spill in the nearby factorium. There just weren't many people here. Perhaps it was just an unlucky district where superstitious workers always assumed the deformed or the destitute came from. Triskelion could feel his temper rising. I've squandered on this dross. Be calm. Go over the data. Because that was like counting over the beads of Archibus or calculating prime numbers. It was the baseline of mindful worship, centering his thinking into the channels and conduits that had befitted a tech priest. And so he ran through the most recent batch of metrics from these new conscripts, turning over figures over and over again in his head, and stopped. So very healthy, every one of them. Strapping conscripts to the Scutari, or perhaps destined to be the pride of some guard unit. Not a mutation amongst them. Murad was not a healthy world. The baseline toxins in the air, food, and water didn't lead to robust people. Everyone outside the Palladium's comforts was a little sick. Not this lot. Although they've been specially selected for this very purpose, as though they've been specially selected for this very purpose. And Triskelion could have counted himself blessed and moved on to the next district. Any other tech priest would have. Where's the rest of them? He asked. A simple question nobody there had an answer to. And when the Scutari and the locals alike stared at him dumbly, he said, "Move into the buildings. I want a room-by-room search." Because what he was seeing here was called, in the old text, a skewed sample. Where are your papers? That's what Triskellion's wondering. Where are your papers? There was graffiti on the nearest buildings he saw. Nothing strange there. It was just about the only means of personal expressions for the South Chasm denizens. And it was almost disappointingly orthodox, really. No pornography or obscenities or revolution. A badly proportioned picture of a smiling emperor raining little stars down on a host of little stick people who are standing with their twiggy arms upraised in jubilation. But the more he stared at it, the more disquieting he found it. What he thought was a lack of artistic merit began to look more and more like a style he couldn't quite appreciate. Surely that smile was too broad, almost ear to ear, and the emperor was depicted with the fan of arms so as to pour out all the more blessings on his subjects. And some of those stick figures, yes, they had more limbs than was strictly necessary. Adept, a signal from the Scutari Alpha. Report. We have encountered inconsistencies with the clave plan filed at the central archive. Elaborate. Triskelion pushed forward, adjusting his receiver so that he could hear the words over the groan of the tortured plascrete and dropping rubble. At his thought, a servitor skull floated in to sea. Unlicensed excavations beneath the tenement, Adept. The whole area may be structurally unsound. For a moment, he assumed it was some lost mine shaft, but the Scutari were clustered around a hatch set into the ground. Sent down, the servitor skull revealed a claustrophobic chamber with several low doorways leading to more and more. Rag-shrouded figures scurried away from the skull's light, hiding their eyes. There was Katari down there already, grabbing people and hauling them, pale and worm-like, up into the light and air. Others were still proceeding, down into the chamber, upon chamber, a host of scrambling, shambling denizens, scurrying like rodents before them. The skull's relaying eye, caught sight of the marks of that peculiar run of mutations. The most deviant of them could have been cousins to the assassin, their skin shading to bruise colors, horny and cracked at the joints, their teeth pronounced and sharp, their eyes amber or red. Bring in an excavator, Triskelion ordered, feeling a thread of excitement pull taut within him. Within minutes, the machine was already being hauled from a nearby demolition site, and, rather than risk his followers down in those increasingly tight and difficult spaces below, he determined he'd simply go at things the most direct way. The excavator was a bullish metal monster, a bulky Goliath chassis with the great assemblage of rock-grinding teeth mounted on its front. It could carve out a new quarry face from solid rock in an hour. The worm-eaten labyrinth of half-devoured earth beneath the tenement would take it moments. He heard a shrieking and clamoring from below, voices that sounded barely human in their panic and distress as the excavator advanced. The buildings above started to move, and suddenly, with a huge crash, half of it slipped away and collapsed, slumping into its neighbors. Fissuring at their walls, his Qatari scattered to avoid the debris. Triskelion barely noticed. He was absorbed in what the skull was showing him, past the Goliath's whirling teeth. Chambers within chambers, hidden from Murad's orange sun for generations, until he stripped mind into them. An unregistered mass of hideous, pallid people fleeing yet deeper into the earth like grubs, winked out from their burrows. The offering wagon would be packed full before he sent it back to the palace. And then a larger space, exposed like an egg, a chamber of some Xenos hive dweller. A long room lined with what seemed like corpses. No, invalids. Alpha, clear the room of mobile antagonists. Confirmed, Adept. The Qatari moved to kicking and beating anyone who could move, driving them away, leaving only those lying in neat rows along the wall. They lay on mattresses packed so close not an inch of floor was visible, and they were sick, or some had some sort of injuries Triskelion was more than familiar with from the factories and forges. His skull's eye saw makeshift equipment attached to several, feeding them fluids, monitoring their vital signs. There was some kind of impoverished medical facility. The thought took him by surprise. He hadn't thought the denizens of these wretched districts either had the inclination or knowledge for such a thing. And there, a brief glimpse at the far end of the room, a man in a white coat, almost a parody of a physician, darting away into some further chamber. Haul him out, Triskelion ordered. A clash of priorities is detected, the Alpha informed him, hesitating. Triskelion hurriedly revisited the logic pathways of his orders and felt a stab of excitement. Were these invalids offerings, or were they new subjects? He looked as though they would fall equally into both categories. Just take them as offerings for now. He would go through the cells later for any who met his criteria. He was head down himself, unable to simply remain distant and aloof. There was something strange here, and he wanted to investigate it in person. Adept. A signal from one of the attachments on the street level. The locals are massing. What are your orders? Triskelion set the skull out. Its viewpoint showed him locals gathering in the adjoining claves. Suddenly, there were scores of them, hundreds even. The Qatari identified primitive firearms, industrial tools, even explosives. Triskelion pressed on, at the very front now, kicking in the next door himself, finding no trace of the man in white. Just a private little chapel, bitter incense still burning. He was reconfiguring his own eyes, inloading fresh programs he flung together and changed moment to moment. He was half convinced he'd imagined the Medicae, the thought just conjured by a room full of patients.
Another signal from outside. There really was quite a crowd out there now, thronging the far end of the street. There was some kind of heavy machinery coming in, an earth mover or drill from the mines. Sigatari were digging in for a real fight, but Jaskillen had no wish to get personally mired in that kind of distraction. And there, molecular material analysis showed him the other room, beyond this one, reaching reached to a sliding panel he'd never seen with unaugmented vision. In moments his troops had broken through and stopped, awaiting instructions, because the protocols didn't cover this. Triskelion stared. It was a laboratory, a lab put together by someone who had access to what they could salvage or steal from the industrial workings. True, but a lab nonetheless, and one devoted to what Brazilian would disdainfully call the soft sciences. The man in the white coat was at a table, frantically working away at something lying there. Triskelion pushed forwards and saw a brute. Was his unavoidable first impression. A huge figure, bulked out with uncontrolled excesses of musculature, skin partially hardened into something almost like carapace. Shuddering and straining against his restraints, and the Medicaid was frantically releasing it. He was freeing it from the slab. Triskelion leapt back. At the same time, the Skatari were pushing forwards, their priorities reconfigured in response to the threat. The thing sat up. By any conventional standards, it was hideous, each part of it out of proportion with the rest, and its face a fist-like knot of rage and agony. It was 10 feet tall and almost as broad, lurching forwards to balance itself with the muscles of one distended arm. It bellowed, deafening in the enclosed space, and then lurched forwards, knocking 3 Skatari over. Against the wall. The crackle of carbine fire laced into its rugged hide, charring and melting flesh without seeming to do anything more than enrage it. The Skatari shot it and beat it and bayoneted it, and it was barely slowed for them. It was clumsy and seemed to have an imperfect command of its colossal frame, or else might have butchered the lot of them. It was an abomination. Obviously it was, but some part of Triskelion watched its flesh knit and mend even as it shuddered beneath the carbine shot and thought, such regenerative properties! It smashed another Skatari down. A brief burst of error messages in Triskellion's head before the spark of its life went out. No matter. The service was what the soldiers of the tech priests were made for. Triskelion, about to vacate the room until the fighting was over, abruptly changed his mind. Risk versus research weighing in his mind. He scuttled past the beast as it bellowed and staggered, and ended up with his mechanical hand about the Medicaid's throat with a pistol pressed to the man's temple. Have it pacified, he said sternly. Please, the Medicaid got out with revulsion. Triskelion saw tears in his eyes, and the monster was shot and battered. Have it pacified, and I shall spare it, Triskelion directed, not sure whether he was telling the truth or not. With a whimper, the white-coated man made a convulsive gesture at one of the trays of haphazard instruments and Medicaid tools. Triskelion released him, and the pistol tracked his every movement. Neem! The man called out, and the monster heeded him, the Medicaid's voice cutting through all the rage instantly. Triskelion called off to the Skatari, watching intently. Here, Neem! Come here now! There's a good boy. The man's voice trembled wretchedly. The monster shambled over and crouched before him obediently. With a quick motion, the man found a point of the thing's anatomy that would receive a needle and injected it with something that had its form slump over into a mound of mismatched, slumbering flesh. I should burn it, Triskelion thought. Something foul was going on here, something beyond the tenets of scriptural science. And, based on his prior researches, he rather thought he knew what it might be. Burn it down, all of it. Annihilate the clave, the district. Cut away the diseased flesh. Instead, he found himself saying, Secure the creature, and you come here. The Medicaid cringed over to him, a groveling little thing in the shadow of the Skatari. Triskelion glowered down at him sternly, enjoying the man's terror. Designation, worker. Tesling, adept, the man whispered. They call me Dr. Tesling. I help here. Help? How does this abomination help? He was sick, adept, Tesling whimpered. But he is strong now. Strong enough to work. Strong enough to survive. Survive anything, adept. Burn them all. But Triskillion's mind was full of his own researches, the maddening gaps between his aspirations and results. Take it all, he ordered. Load them into the offering wagons. And everyone move on to the next district. When they saw he had their doctor, the crowd outside began to surge forwards, the Skitarii shooting, burning the boldest of them. Triskelion put out a call for a handful of dragoons to reinforce them. He marked how quickly they'd assembled, so many called, in such a short time. His Skitarii were already falling into the civic warfare protocols he'd prepared for them. He sent the order to fall back and move on to the next district, rewriting Skitarii priority queues until they just packed up and retreated, the angry crowd left in undisputed possession of its home turf. No questions, nobody reporting him to Brazilian behind his back. He had made himself a keynote in their hierarchy, the very voice of the Emperor, as far as they were concerned. I will burn it all down, he reassured himself. Later. There was always later. He rode back atop the offerings wagon. The doctor hunched beside it, jostled and miserable, bruised where one of the Skitarii had struck him. Triskelion was looking forward to examining the contents of that man's head.